We can hear you. So Theo, I was just mentioning to the class that it's very fortuitous that you're here at this moment, because in the last few years we've had a few protests on campus. I guess the last one, some people may remember, we had the graduate student protests. But before that, and Theo, I mentioned in email to you, we currently have a protest going on, if you know, down toward the library, sort of diagonally across from North Hall, regarding the Palestinian war going on now. And the major protest that we had before this, and by the way, if people want to put any questions to Theo, the Q&A is open, so we're at Q&A for lecture number 11. But the last major protest before that was right across the quad here in Cheadle Hall. And if people didn't know, Cheadle Hall is where the administrative offices for the chancellor, the vice chancellors, or many of the vice chancellors, the deans are all there. And a group of students, in part led by Theo, occupied that building in the sense of protested, not by setting up tents outside the way it's happening now, but by actually being in the building. And what they were interested in doing was to get the UC to divest from fossil fuels. But why am I telling this story? Theo, why don't you tell us, well, first off, Theo, how did you get interested in all this? By the way, you see I'm turning, I have two different screens here. How did you get interested in all this, Theo, to begin with? And take us back at least to when you were a graduate student here at UCSB.
Yeah, I'll take you back further than that. So I come from a political family. My mother is a member of parliament for the Green Party in the United Kingdom. I was raised with very environmental and social justice values from a young age. And I also went to a quite privileged school when I was in high school, which was an international school that my dad taught at. He was an English teacher. And the juxtaposition of the kind of values that I was taught at this kind of elite school for the neoliberal upper class on the one hand, and then having these very radical political values being instilled in me at home was kind of the making of my own political education. And a lot of my early political thought was about how can I try and communicate the values that I'm learning about at home in this context of this this school where my friends are all the children of the business class and of wealthy ambassadors and this sort of thing. So that's kind of where my interest in communicating around environmental and social justice issues came from. But it was a very limited way to do activism, to do organizing when I was in high school. It was really the sort of what you think of as classic environmentalism, collecting bottle tops to recycle them, plastic bottle tops, getting the school to put solar panels on the roof, going around flyering, trying to get people to change their own personal behavior. And I ended up being quite frustrated with that kind of way of doing environmentalism. It didn't seem to me to be getting to the root causes of the problem. And so I kind of left the environmental movement for a bit. I got more interested in human rights work and joined our Amnesty International club. And it was only when I came to UCSB as an undergraduate exchange student from the UK that I took a class with John Ferran called Earthing Crisis. And that class really brought together for me in an intellectual way the social justice and the environmental justice and climate justice movements, and brought me back into this this world, this environmental justice and climate justice world, in a way that I had not had that kind of lens or frame before. And so that class is really what drove me to then join the fossil fuel divestment campaign, which had just started up on campus. And that was 10 or 11 years ago now. And that campaign really spoke to my own kind of aggravations with the environmental movement, and also with the progressive movement more generally, about how we tried to communicate on our issues, and just seeing a deep failure to move larger audiences. And the fossil fuel divestment campaign was all about trying to change the story that we tell about climate change, so that it was less about changing your light bulbs, collecting plastic bottle tops, saving the polar bears, as important as protecting ecosystems is, and also personal changes, but more about power, about who has power, why they have it, how it's held to account, and how it can be challenged. And in this story, we talked about the fossil fuel industry as the driving cause of the climate crisis. And this I found very, very compelling. And it seemed that the people that I was then communicating with found that story much more compelling than the kind of guilt and shaming that the environmental movement had been engaging in up to that point.
I want to jump on to that whole fossil fuel divestment movement. But first, Theo, so it doesn't get ignored, you also were at COP21. Am I remembering that right? You were with the UCSB contingent that went there?
So I've been to the 3 of the UN climate talks.
Right, so that was 2015 December. I remember you came back and did a presentation, but you went over with a small contingent of UCSB students to be, you were in well, maybe you should tell us a little about that, because there was an effort to have large-scale student protests, but that all sort of got shut down, or at least kind of constrained by the bombing that happened before that. So I just want to kind of give a little broader history of your activism. So
through the university, I was able to join a group of students in Paris for the UN climate talks, which were really hailed as one of the breakthrough climate talks, where the goal of keeping global warming limited to 1.5 degrees was agreed upon. There's a lot that was deeply flawed about the climate talks, but having that goal achieved was an important accomplishment. The context and the backdrop is that these negotiations have been going on since, I think, the year before I was born. And constantly have failed to really produce any kind of meaningful action on climate change at an international level. This is partly because there is obstruction from the petro-states, including the United States, Canada, Australia, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and also just more directly the influence of the fossil fuel industry over those climate talks. The Paris negotiations were important because this was really seen as one of the key moments that we would be able to try and move decision makers on being bolder in climate action. And the climate justice movement had been growing in size and scale and its ambition, and had really taken on this frame of keep it in the ground, the way that we're going to ensure that global warming does not exceed 1.5 degrees is by keeping fossil fuels in the ground. That is the number one thing that we can do. So the climate justice movement had cohered around that as a leading message, along with reparations for climate damages in the global south, and had built this big infrastructure to do these heavy-hitting actions and campaigns in Paris, on the streets of Paris, during these climate talks. Now, a couple of weeks before the climate talks took place, there was this horrific bombing of a concert in Paris, and this led to the police in France really clamping down on any kind of protest. And so this was one of the examples where we saw firsthand how the elites are responding to climate action, and this is a trend that has continued and gotten worse, is that we're seeing more and more repression of any kind of protest to try and get leaders to act more ambitiously on climate. And it was one of the most visceral examples of this, where no protest was allowed. There were heavily armed police on all of the street corners it was really quite scary. And people did still find ways to creatively make ourselves heard, but all of that kind of work that had gone into kind of create these productive disruptions in Paris was thrown out the window. And that was, for me, a moment of understanding that we are not going to be able to resolve the climate crisis without going up against the coercive power of those elites.
Yeah, thanks for that. And it's great also, Theo, to do that in that we often think of the climate youth movement was sort of beginning with Greta Thunberg and then after that Sunrise and all, but it was alive and well before that. And certainly it's terrific that it came on the scene with Greta Thunberg and all. But anyhow, UCSB, divestment movement. Could you tell us first why we needed to divest? What were UCSB and more broadly the UC investments in fossil fuels all about, and why it was important to take on that particular issue?
Yeah. So in 2012, 2013, Bill McKibben, who you all have already heard from, the famous environmental leader, put on something called the Do the Math Tour. And on this tour and in various media products as well, really communicated the idea that the fossil fuel industry has 5 times more coal, oil, and gas in their reserves than even the most conservative scientists say is safe to burn and maintain a stable climate. And this really changed the narrative that we told about climate change away from those personal individual actions and towards like, this industry is really what is driving the crisis. And if we truly believe that this is a crisis, then investing in that industry is morally wrong. So university campuses, through their endowments, have, and also pension funds and things like that, have millions, if not billions of dollars invested in fossil fuel companies. The UC had something like $3 billion invested in fossil fuel companies, whilst also claiming to be a climate leader. So we started this campaign in 2013 and 2014 to really put more pressure on the university regents who have the kind of decision-making power over investments to try and get them to take their investments out of the fossil fuel industry. The kind of slogan was that if it's wrong to wreck the climate, then it is wrong to profit from that wreckage. And the goal was not so much to see divestment happen. That was kind of its secondary goal. The primary goal was, as I've been saying, is to change the way that we talked about the climate crisis. It was to use this campaign to talk about the climate crisis as one about power and one where we were trying to delegitimize the fossil fuel industry so that its influence over decision makers would be lessened. And that, I think, has actually been one of the great successes of the legacy of the divestment movement, is that 10 years on, we really do talk about the climate crisis in a very different way. And that has set the table for Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future climate strikes movement, as well as the Sunrise movement. The Sunrise movement came directly out of the fossil fuel divestment movement. And they were able to do what they were able to do because the divestment movement had changed the terms of the debate, and they had put the onus squarely on the fossil fuel industry and the politicians that enabled them as being responsible for the climate crisis, and attacking that structure of legitimacy being key to being able to resolve this crisis.
Yeah, so I want to ask you about the nuts and bolts of how the protest took place. And for everyone, right, we're at week number 6, Q&A for lecture number 11 is open. Some questions are already coming in, but put them in if you want. But let me just clarify something, Theo, and you kind of alluded to it before. There was big thinking years back, decade back, that personal action was just so important. So if you were approaching this issue of fossil fuels in the position of personal action, you might say something like, well, I'll get rid of having a car, I'll bike everywhere, I'll use mass transit, and that's how we'll solve the problem. And that was sort of the approach used. But you're talking about a shift in approach. Could you kind of flesh that out a little more?
Right. So about 90 companies are responsible, about 70 companies are responsible for about 90% of fossil fuel emissions since, I believe, the 1980s. So if we take that and compare it to the minuscule amount of difference that individual action will achieve, it is much more strategic and effective to stop the fossil fuel industry from extracting and burning fossil fuels and keeping us dependent on that energy system than it is for each of us to shift our individual actions. And moreover, the kind of individualist approach to this crisis really assumes that people have the means and are able to afford to make those changes. And in many cases, that's not the case, where people who are just trying to get by, who are not able to buy an electric vehicle, who are not able to pay to put solar panels on their house, going to them and telling them that they need to make lifestyle changes is really not a winning strategy. It doesn't really speak to the imbalances of power and privilege that exist and that have kind of driven this problem. And so shifting the emphasis to the people in power, and particularly the influence that the fossil fuel industry has had over them, was a way to bring more people into our movement, and without shaming or guilt or kind of forcing them to feel guilty about their own actions, which in the scale of things are much smaller compared to what the fossil fuel industry has done. And people will often respond to that saying, yes, but aren't we all we're the ones who are buying and consuming the fossil fuel industry's products. And that's true. But the reason that we are still doing that is because the fossil fuel industry engaged in a very sophisticated campaign of denial, to deny the climate crisis and keep us hooked on fossil fuels, and also to undermine climate solutions, 20, 30 years ago. And if we had moved on those then, we'd be in a very different place now. But we are still hooked on fossil fuels because the industry has manufactured that demand through its influence over political decision-making.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And in a couple of weeks, we have Naomi Oreskes coming to talk about that denial in some detail. But Theo, so Cheetah Hall across the way, and I encourage everybody when you leave today, look across at that building. And Theo, take us back, nuts and bolts. What actually happened there during the protests?
Yeah. So we had been building this fossil fuel divestment campaign for several years. We had had this great overwhelming amount of interest and coverage of the divestment campaign when it really kicked off in 2013. And then we went into kind of a real dip of we didn't win straight away, and people started thinking doesn't feel winnable. The UC regents are just not moving on this. We've gone to their UC regents meetings and spoken at their public comments. We've gone into committees with them to try and resolve this. We've submitted thousands of names on petitions. We've got different student governments to endorse the campaign, and yet nothing was moving them. And so over the next couple of years, we really saw a decline in participation in this campaign. And I remember sitting in the library, me and two other people just banging our heads on the wall, being, how can we actually get people involved in this again? And then with the uprising at Standing Rock against the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was a pipeline that was transporting fracked oil and gas from the North Dakota Bakken shale field through the Standing Rock Sioux Indigenous Reservation, just north of it, and under their sacred sites and through the river that they depended upon for their clean water and that everyone downriver also depended upon. This moment really kind of reinvigorated the climate justice movement and also the divestment campaign, because people started thinking how can we actually address this on our campus? And so we saw a big influx in participation in our campaign. Something else that we did was recruit. So I was a teaching assistant at that point and recruited a lot of my students. I was teaching for John Ferran at that time from his class to join this campaign. And people were really excited about that. And so we actually built a very effective team It was no longer 3 people just banging our heads against the wall in the library. It was 10 of us who were really kind of strategically building this campaign and getting our name out on campus. And maybe you all know, maybe you don't, the Standing Rock campaign ultimately did not achieve its goals, which was to keep the pipeline out and to prevent the pipeline being built. It was built, oil now flows under that river. And at the same time, we saw the brutal repression of those activists who had been campaigning against it. Fast forward, and we get the election of Donald Trump, and this again kind of turbocharges people's involvement and wanting to be more engaged. And so this was really the moment that we thought, okay, if we can't get the UC to divest now, when can we do it? And so we made a shift in our tactics to really escalate the campaign over several months. And so we planned to do a sit-in in Cheadle Hall to get the university to divest from fossil fuels. And this sit-in was something that we were going to do in conjunction with several other UC campuses to really make our mark and to show that we were done with the kind of backroom negotiations. We needed them to act now. And I think we started planning it in February. We ended up doing the sit-in in May, probably about right this time in May, I suppose. It was an overwhelming response. We started off with maybe 50 people coming and sitting in, and then people took their classes and did their classes in the sit-in. And I think we had about 400 people total who came through to join part of the sit-in at some point. We had around 30 to 50 people staying in overnight, over 3 nights. And it was really people from all across campus, different kind of social groups, mingling, and it was because people had reached out to their friend networks. That was the real key, is they brought in their friends from the fraternities and the sororities, from the lacrosse team, from the Black Student Union, from El Congreso, and it was really this network of friend groups that was brought in, and that was a big learning for me. And the ultimate result of that sit-in was negotiating with Chancellor Yang to get his endorsement on the campaign. We said that we will not leave until we get your endorsement on this campaign. And Chancellor Yang did ultimately endorse, and he became the first UC chancellor to endorse. 3 other chancellors followed suit, and this put a lot more pressure on the UC regents. They still didn't divest though. The next thing that had to happen was to get the faculty involved. And so the faculty senates across the UC then passed resolutions over the next couple of years, also saying that we support this. And that was really the moment in 2019 when the whole UC-wide faculty senate voted saying, yes, we want the UC to divest, that there was this kind of overwhelming upswell of pressure that the UC regents couldn't ignore. And so it was really the kind of students and the faculty working together, along with the fact that the fossil fuel industry was less and less profitable, that moved the UC regents to divest. The fascinating kind of epilogue to this story is that when the UC divested, the chief investment officer took out a full-page op-ed opinion piece in the LA Times to explain exactly why the UC was doing this, and categorically disavowed any involvement of students and student activism in making their decision. And as I was saying, like, divestment was about changing the story about climate change. So if we divested and it was not for climate reasons, that didn't really help us tell our story. And it also completely undermined kind of years of student activism and ignored years of student activism, where the UC was saying they only divested for financial reasons. And of course that was untrue. If there had been no divestment movement, they would still be invested in fossil fuels. And so we took out our own article in The Nation to really set the record straight. And we, with Bill McKibben, wrote an article explaining how student leadership had forced the university's hand and made them divest. And the reasons why we did it was because if it is wrong to profit from the climate crisis, is wrong to invest in. So if it's wrong to wreck the climate, it is wrong to profit from that wreckage.
Yeah, yeah, that was amazing when that LA Times ad came out. Theo, a lot of questions here, but I want to ask one last one of my own before I jump to the Q&A. And again, people put them in the Q&A if you would for lecture number 11. And that is this, Theo, you mentioned a lot of other groups got involved and all, but I'm just kind of curious, what was the size, and you kind of mentioned it, but just to underscore it maybe, of the core group of people who actually did this here at UCSB? So sometimes you think, you just can't do anything, you really need thousands of people involved, but the core group that started all this, just about how many people were involved?
Not more than 12. However, as I said, they had their networks, which were much bigger, but the core organizing group at the beginning was probably 8 to 12 people. Then it really dipped down to 5 people for a couple of years. And then it came back up to about 10 or so. And so it wasn't big. It wasn't a big group of students who were organizing this. If you've got 10 really dedicated friends, and I think it is important that you're building friendship and relationship along the way, you can do a lot, as we did. And there wasn't really anything that much more, there wasn't, much special about us. We had different kind of skills. Some of them had design skills, some of them were great communicators. But that's true of every student cohort. So there wasn't really anything special about that group. We just came together and wanted to do it. I think one of the things that helped was the fact that I had been doing it for several years, and the university will often just try and wait these things out. And because I did an undergrad and then grad school, I was able to stay and kind of keep this thing alive even in those times when it was very small. And I think that was critical to just keeping the movement going and also building relationships with student leaders on other UC campuses. So having that deeper bench of leadership and being able to train new leaders is really important when you're working on a multi-year campaign that the university thinks that it can just wait out until you graduate.
Yeah, it's just amazing how few people are needed to make changes that are so big. In that case, I mean, billions of dollars of money that was taken away from the fossil fuel industry. But okay, I've been monopolizing you. Let me start reading some of the questions. And some of these, Theo, you can tell they're thinking about what's happening on campus right now. First question, how can we calmly and respectfully deal with counter-protesters? What is the best way to handle misinformation and harmful propagation, I think propaganda against the oppressed?
Yeah, there's 2 really big questions there. One thing that I've learned from being in protest camps is the importance of having people who are assigned as the de-escalators. These should be people who have some experience having aggressive challenges right up in their face and being able to stay calm in those situations and keeping people on message. And those are the de-escalators. That role is so important when the purpose of the kind of the counter protest is to try and to get you riled up and to say things that you don't mean and to get you angry and then get that on camera. So having those people in that specific role who are trained to do de-escalation is really important. And there are lots of organizations that offer that training. So you can try and find some of those de-escalation trainings if that's a role that you're interested in. It is something that I think is often better for folks in more privileged positions to take on. And kind of be a bulwark between them and the core organizers. Usually, you do not want a core organizer to also be a de-escalator, but that would be just one very concrete response to that question. And then the other one is stay on message, is that the protest camps have developed a very clear set of demands. And when you are faced with the kind of sometimes really horrible rhetoric and even violence of counter-protesters, it's very difficult to kind of keep your message clear and clean. But doing that really will make sure that they fail in their goals, which is to undermine your legitimacy. So staying on message is very important. Having people who are designated as your messengers and as spokespeople is also really critical there.
Yeah, that's great advice. Theo, apologize for 1 minute. I have to do a little housekeeping here and start an iClicker poll, which I hadn't done before. So folks, do the iClicker. So Theo, the next question is two parts, and I'll just ask you the first part, then we can go back to the second. And again, if folks have questions, put them in the Q&A for lecture number 11. First question. Some of the pushback, so Theo, just to frame it a little more, what the protesters are asking for in part is divestment from weapons manufacturing by UCSB in particular. So here's the question. Some of the pushback against UCSB divestment in weapons manufacturing is that tuition prices will rise in order to cover those costs. Did you experience something similar with your demands for divestment from the fossil fuel industry?
Yes, we heard very similar arguments. We heard that research centers would have to close down, that tuition fees would rise. And this is all about trying to pit students against one another. That's the strategy. I don't think that there's much truth to it. And we were able to show in the divestment campaign against fossil fuels that if the UC had invested in a different portfolio, they could have actually made more money than if they were invested in fossil fuels. So that was a helpful counterpoint. And if you can find examples of that too in the campaigns to divest from weapons companies and show that there are alternatives that could be more profitable, it's a helpful argument to have in your back pocket as well. And that's what we did. But ultimately, that's a strategy to try and pit students against one another. And the way to refuse that is to kind of rise above it and say, the reason that the tuition fees are rising and have continued to rise is not because of student activism, it's because of the continuing kind of neoliberalization and privatization of education. That's the real problem. And if we want to unite around a goal, it should be to get more public investment in our public universities. So that's where I'd pivot to that. Rather than trying to get bogged down in the nitty-gritty of how much this is going to cost the university.
Yeah. So the second part of that question, somewhat related, here it is. Do you have any suggestions of how we can protest against Chancellor Yang making a salary of $600,000 a year and to invest that back into our students and our community?
I mean, it's a good counterpoint to what I was just saying, as well as like the massive amount of money that the university leadership are raking in is another reason that the tuition is high, and kind of the massive bureaucracies that the universities are in have to keep things going, and paying the leadership of those bureaucracies so much is, that's where you could pivot to. But I think that the ways to my experience with working with and sometimes against Chancellor Yang was that he's very good at deflection. And he was really canny about how to deal with student protests, because what he was going to do with the Cheadle Hall occupation, we forced a choice point, basically. Either you capitulate to our demands, or you have to call in campus security and forcibly remove the occupiers. And he was very good at kind of weaving between those options, and he really did not want to call in security and the police. And so we found that we had to try and find ways of justifying further escalation to really create that crisis moment for him to be like, okay, yes, I have to respond to the UC students' demands. And the way that we did that was refusing to move, but then also kind of taking further, we took the first floor and then the second floor and then kind of going up the building as a way to kind of quite literally illustrate escalation. So that's something that I found with specifically the UC Chancellor at UCSB. Also, when you get into negotiations with him, he's all very calm and very reasonable. And so I think really just the conversation just kind of goes like water. and flows in different directions. And so just really trying to find that like core message that you're trying to communicate and what you want from him, and sticking to that is very important too.
Yeah. I'll just say that's sage advice for anyone wondering, how Chancellor Yang is going to respond to the current situation, what resolved it last time, but I'll just leave it at that. Next question, Theo. And this is really, so what are your personal experiences with police presence at protests? And it wasn't this year, but last year, Kim Stanley Robinson, who came this year, but last year he talked about how things sort of changed after Seattle in the 1990s with respect to the police presence at protests. But any thoughts on that?
Lots of thoughts. So I wrote my PhD dissertation on the 3 different types of power that the fossil fuel industry is able to wield in order to maintain its status. And one of those is coercive power, the use of force. And this was kind of one of the first times I was exposed to that it was in Paris with the massive militarization of police to clamp down on any kind of protest in 2015. And then the next place that was really brought home was at Standing Rock, where we saw huge amounts of militarized police, the National Guard brought in to ultimately terrorize and intimidate the Standing Rock Sioux and the water protectors into capitulation. Something else they'll also do is infiltrate protest camps, they'll send in people who will be agitators to try and break them up, and they will be trying to gather as much intelligence as they can on different protesters to then try and prosecute them later. So that's all terrifying. I think the response is remaining peaceful. What they're trying to do is they're trying to goad you into a violent response, which will then legitimize their further escalation and repression. And I think also it's about maintaining kind of a culture of radical transparency. So there really isn't much that we can do realistically to prevent infiltration into our movements. It's pretty, when you're kind of taking the step of escalating to the level of setting up protest camps, that's kind of, it's a given that at some point they will be infiltrated. What we have to be really good at is not allowing that to lead us into paranoia and into finger pointing. And that means having really clear and transparent leadership structures. So being okay with having leaders, but making sure that those are accountable and understanding how decisions are getting made. Some other ways that we've tried to, like different parts of our movement have tried to respond to this policing of dissent, is to kind of break into smaller affinity groups where you really know everyone in that group. And so you just know that you can trust those folks. And each one of those affinity groups might have their own part of the puzzle, but no one knows the whole plan. Sometimes that can work, sometimes it doesn't. But there are different ways that we can respond, but none of them are perfect. And often the trade-off is you can be less transparent, less democratic, but potentially more safe, or you can be more democratic, more transparent, and potentially open yourself up to infiltration. And that's just the trade-off that each group has to make for themselves. There isn't a right or wrong answer there, and each situation will require a different response as well. But yes, to answer the broader question, we've seen this much greater increase in policing of protest. We've seen also since Standing Rock as well, we've seen these laws come into play, which are critical infrastructure laws across different states, where if you are caught trespassing near fossil fuel infrastructure, you can be charged with terrorism and other really hyped up charges, which are all intended to just intimidate any kind of resistance to the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, great answer. A lot of questions. So next one. You speak of changing the story. Do you think that changing the label climate crisis or global warming would further assist the cause? Do you think that it would help further change the story? If so, do you have any suggestions for a different label? So yeah, we often hear maybe the next thing will be climate catastrophe, but does that really describe what's going on, or I guess who's behind it? So what do you think, Theo? Any ideas?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. I definitely don't have the answer to what we should call it. I think framing it in positive terms versus negative ones can be helpful. So that's why I talk more about climate justice and a just transition away from fossil fuels. So we do know that positive framing is more effective. The terminology around crisis is somewhat fraught. Who gets to define it as a crisis, and how do we respond when we're told it's a crisis? We kick into emergency mode. Are we going to be repeating the same kind of forms of oppression that have driven up the point already? Because we're just trying to do what is the most effective and efficient thing rather than what is the most just thing when we're in emergency mode. I still think that the term crisis is useful. It does bring out that sense of urgency, which is important, but I do think we need to use that in more nuanced ways, because urgency and emergency have been used to justify atrocities in the past in the name of preservation of our species. And so we do really need to interrogate that at the same time as recognizing that, yes, this is an urgent crisis. And we need our decision makers to respond urgently. But that doesn't mean that we need knee-jerk reactions, or that we should be investing in these false solutions that seem like they'll just be the silver bullet fix, like geoengineering or carbon capture and storage. That's kind of the elite's response in an emergency mode. And I think we need to think more about what a progressive emergency language looks like.
Yeah. Let me just clarify something. I didn't introduce you, Theo, as where you work right now, because I really wanted to have you sort of personally here. But next question you may not be able to answer, and if you do so, you might want to clarify that. So in other words, last year Peter Kelmus came, who works for NASA, was talking about protesting, and he said right off the bat, these are not the views of NASA, this is what I think. But again, you may not be able to answer, but here we go. Are the UCs involved with perpetuating the Palestinian genocide? If so, in what ways?
Yeah, and thank you for framing it up that way. So yeah, I am not speaking today on behalf of my organization. I'm speaking as an organizer who's been involved in the climate justice movement for the last 10 to 12 years. So that's kind of what I'm sharing today. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Center for Biological Diversity, which is where I work. I personally do believe that if the university has remained silent in the face of this genocide, then it is complicit in that genocide. And that if it is investing in the weapons that are being used to perpetrate that genocide, then they are also complicit in that genocide. So that is my personal response. As a climate justice organizer, I also think that there are the important connections to make between what's happening in Palestine and in Israel, and the work that we're doing to achieve climate justice, because I don't believe that we can achieve climate justice in a world that allows genocide to happen and is silent in the face of genocide. But more specifically, we're looking also at, I was at action over the weekend with kayaktivists, the Richmond City Rays, who are protesting the role that Chevron has played in the city of Richmond and their refinery there, which is polluting those frontline communities, leading to all sorts of awful health harms. And they were drawing the connection between the atrocities that Chevron has committed in that community and in Ecuador, where it's extracting oil, and also in the Middle East, where it is heavily invested in offshore gas field off the coast of Gaza, and that it is profiting off this, and that the state of Israel is working with Chevron to extract that the gas from that field. So there are some like very clear connections to be drawn as well.
Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that as an intersectional issue. So next question, kind of a nuts and bolts question. Here it is. What are the important aspects of organizing, and what can we implement in our protests on campus now?
Important aspects of organizing. So none of what I'm going to say is like the be all and end all. These are just some lessons that I think I've learned over the last 10 or so years. Meeting people where they're at is one that we talk about a lot. So rather than speaking with folks in our frames and in the kind of what motivates us as activists or us as organizers, try and find what that common ground is, what shared values you have, and speak to those. And so in a concrete example of that in the California climate space is around public health. We found like the public health messaging to be something that really moves people around taking on the fossil fuel industry more than the climate messaging. We connect them, but the role that the industry has played in polluting frontline communities, the air that they breathe, the water that they drink, the food that they eat, has messaging around that has really connected with people in a way that the climate crisis might still seem far away. So that's an example of meeting people where they're at and working together across those lines. Kind of connected to that, another piece of advice I have is to work according to a spectrum of allies. This is a concept that was developed a long time ago, but I believe is outlined in a great little book called Organizing Cools the Planet. And this concept is basically that rather than trying to convince people who are all the way over this side on the spectrum of like opposition and will always be opposed to us, don't try and spend your energy there. Try and go for like the middle section. If you're thinking of like a spectrum, try and go for that middle section of people who don't really know about this or who are neutral on it, and try and move them into being either your passive allies so that they generally agree with you, they might sign a petition, and then that group into your active allies who you're organizing with on a daily basis. So think of that spectrum as how you're going to kind of work with different segments of society. So that really far group, you might be able to move those active opponents into passive opponents by just being overwhelmingly powerful and then being like, there's no point. I disagree with them, but no point. Then you're going to try and move those passive opponents into neutral by kind of making maybe some good arguments, like, okay, maybe they do have a point, I don't really know anymore. And then you're going to try and move the people in the neutral who are like, I've never heard about this. Oh shit, they're polluting my water. Okay, I'm going to sign your petition, and then you move them hopefully into active allies. So it's really that one step over, rather than trying to spend all of your energy over here, moving them over to active allies. So that's the spectrum of allies. I think is a very, very helpful concept because it teaches us how to communicate to different audiences in different ways. Something else that I want to share is a spectrum of strategies. So one thing that I get very frustrated with in progressive movements is our constant kind of rejection of one tactic or another tactic because it is seen as too radical or too reformist. And I want to try and move us out of that language of radical and reformist altogether. That's kind of politically loaded language. Tactics are just tools. They don't have an inherent politics behind them for the most part. You can have a seemingly radical tactic that actually achieves very reformist ends. You could, and similarly, you can have very radical tactics, very reformist tactics that can actually make a huge amount of change that allow us to then take up more space and move our campaigns forward. So when I'm talking about a spectrum of strategies, I'm talking about thinking of the different approaches that we want to take to achieving our goals along the line of whether they are confrontational to non-confrontational. So I'm trying to use that language because I think it gets us out of this kind of radical versus reformist approach and instead allows us to think about what does this tactic do in this specific condition? Is this the right one? Is it more effective to use a non-confrontational tactic right now and then to follow up with something that is more confrontational? Or are we at a point now where we really need this confrontational tactic? And I think that will help us get rid of some of the really deep divisions that exist in our movements. Working coalitions and working in coalitions means that we have much more power than if we're working alone. It also requires us to be flexible and to work across different values, but also in all of that flexibility, remember why you're doing the work and remember what your core values are. And that there is always going to be a point at which you can't compromise or you can't be that flexible. So that's a balance, it's a negotiation that every one of us has to go through, but I really want to encourage folks to be flexible and to engage with that, that balancing act rather than to simply reject working with a group out of hand. Another one is to take wins, even if they're small ones, and celebrate them. Something that really leads to kind of burnout in activist and organizing communities is that we never think that a win is good enough. And yes, they are always going to be partial. There's always going to be more work to do. But if we don't take the time to celebrate those wins, we will burn out. We will just look into this kind of pit of despair and say, what's the point? So it's so important to celebrate and mark those victories as milestones in our ultimate goals, in achieving our ultimate goals. And then the final one, I think, is to use narrative and language strategically. People relate to stories much, much more than they do to just hearing a whole range of facts about the climate crisis. A story about how your family was impacted by a wildfire is going to be much more effective than a range of statistics about how the climate crisis is increasing the extremity and severity of wildfires, and then relating that to your political goals. So those are some of the things that I would say are really important to organizing. The last thing I think is building relationships of trust and accountability and friendships. That is really what's going to keep you going in activist communities.
Yeah, it's a great and complete answer, Theo. The next one's regarding property damage, and I should give you a little foundation. Both Bill McKibben and Kip Stanley Robinson firmly were endorsing the idea of passive resistance, but the person here is asking about property damage and occupying places. So it's a long question, but deserves to be read. Here it is. There is a movement in Mexico regarding the feminine side of women on college campuses. That is, the systematic rape and killing of women, where these women had filed so many complaints, they had gone through all the right systems to attempt to spark political and legislative change, but to no avail. They finally arranged to sit in where they graffitied the buildings and broke windows, saying that, quote, if they can clean the graffiti and mend the windows, but they can't bring back the sisters we've lost, which finally brought about legislative change in the university, required gender classes, etc. Yet, Joe Biden recently aired an opinion regarding protests currently taking place, that property damage is illegal and that everyone protesting should do so in a legal way, including not taking campuses, not occupying a place. What's your opinion on the delegitimization of protests by those higher up due to property damage, even though they would not have any comment towards such protests without those actions, i.e. property damage or taking place?
Yeah, I'm very aware that this is being recorded, so I will be careful with my answers. There is, I think, a real squeamishness around property dismantling, what I like to call strategic dismantling of critical infrastructure. So I think that there are circumstances in which that can really get people's attention. And there are ways that movements have used that strategy to then set a marker in the ground, which other parts of the movement can then respond and say, hey, we're not like that. This is what, you can talk to us, we're the legitimate ones. And that's actually been kind of, there's examples from the civil rights movement, from many movements, from the suffragettes movement, where that kind of radical, not radical because I don't want to use that word, that highly confrontational approach has then enabled the another set of organizers to kind of be the ones that the elites communicate with. And that can actually, I think, be quite strategic. It can be helpful. And those groups don't even have to kind of communicate with one another as long as they're not actively condemning one another. So there are ways, I think, that we just cannot deny the fact that those highly confrontational tactics have helped our movements achieve their goals. But I do not want to come across as saying that that means we just need to go around smashing windows and taking our frustrations out on property that represents the interests of the elite. I think that we have to be much more strategic about how and where and when highly confrontational tactics like that are used as a movement. And so that would be my caution, is that this kind of knee-jerk use of that approach really can undermine us, where it is done in a strategic way, in a kind of arc of escalation, and that there is another group that can kind of position itself as like, we're the reasonable ones. I think that historically has been a role where that has been an effective approach to achieving social change. As an attempt to answer that question while being recorded.
No, that's good. That's good. We're running out of time, but I want to ask you two more questions, Theo. One is, read two more. One is a follow-up on something you just said. Here's the question. You mentioned three powers influenced by the fossil fuel industry, one being coercive or police power or military power. This person wants to know, what are the other two?
Yeah. So when I was in grad school, I got really interested in a political theorist called Antonio Gramsci, who was a communist leader in Italy who was jailed by the Italian fascists and wrote a series of notebooks from jail trying to understand how the Italian Communist Party had failed to win power and how the fascists in the 1930s had been able to do so effectively. And so in this book, he talks about a concept called hegemony, which he identifies as kind of combining two types of power. Consent, the ability to win hearts and minds, to win public opinion, and coercion, the ability to use force to get your way. And he argues that in uprisings in Italy, the communist movement had failed to win the consent of the communities in which they were organizing and in which they were organizing this uprising. And so they were very easily crushed by the violent forces of the state and also by the fascists. And so without having that kind of bulwark of winning popularity and public opinion, their uprisings were very, very vulnerable. So those are the two types of power. I'm really summarizing this. It's much more deeper than that. But the two types of power that he talks about are consent and coercion. There's a third one, though, that I think blurs the lines between consent and coercion, which I call compliance. So we might resist the fossil fuel industry, but be coerced into submission. We might accept it fully into our communities because it has been able to win hearts and minds through things like getting us to identify our city's identity with the Richmond City Refinery, like the high school mascot is called the Oilers. So that's one way that they can win consent. But quite often it's also just this kind of blurring of those two, where we might depend upon the industry economically for our livelihoods and yet still be very aware of the harm that it is doing to our communities. And that dependency on the industry is, I think, a type of power that needs to be broken if we are to break the full influence of the fossil fuel industry on communities. So those three types of power, again, are consent, coercion, and compliance. Consent is more of a cultural relation of power, coercion, more of a political and, in the last resort, violent form of power. And compliance is more of an economic type of power.
Yeah, okay. Last question, again, it's regarding what's happening now. Here's the question. What do you think has led to the success from other UCs, we're talking about Riverside, Berkeley, et cetera, who have managed to have their demands met, divesting from Israel? What are your thoughts on what made it work for them, if you're staying on top of the situation, Theo?
I don't know. I haven't been following it closely enough to know what has worked. I think that what we've seen is like this massive upswelling of solidarity movements that we have not existed in the United States around this issue in the past. And so I think that has been pretty critical. And I think the forms of media that people are consuming now are opening them up to arguments, frames, narratives that we've not been exposed to at a mass scale. And I think that has changed the game quite significantly as well. But I've not been following it closely enough to be able to say.
Yeah. We had Claire Brown here, who I think you know, actually, from UC Berkeley on Monday. We should have asked her then. Anyhow, Theo, thanks so much for coming to our class. Class, can we thank Theo for coming today?
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Theo, it's absolutely terrific. Thanks so much again.
All right, anytime.
Take care. Okay, don't anyone go yet. So taking the second iClicker poll. So there you have it. I don't know who's involved in this room, maybe directly with the protests or indirectly. Hey, everyone should calm down. This is probably the most important part because Theo is being quite modest. We had, of course, the protest, the UAW protest regarding the TAs a couple years ago, but this was the biggest protest in the 21st century on the UCSB campus, and it was the most successful, and he's being modest. I think Theo was probably the lead organizer of it, certainly among the core group, as he noted. So if you have any questions about how to effectively have a protest to get your goals, I'm glad people asked them specifically to Theo, given what's happening right now. So right now there's a makeup exam going on for the midterm. Once we get those in a day or so, I should be able to see what the outcome is, if there's going to be a curve or not. And with any luck, by the end of the week, we'll have the midterm grades up. So, okay, have a great weekend. Oh, wait, stop. Thank you. One more iClicker. That one just finished and I have another one already. That's amazing. Okay, there you go. You need 2 out of 3, so always good to do 3. I'm going to need a designated iClicker reminder person in this class to remind me. Like a little sign, iClicker, iClicker.